Ancestors of the buffalo crossed the Bering Land Bridge between modern Alaska and Russia nearly half a millennia ago. These lumbering creatures, bison latifrons, were much larger than modern buffalo, and they sported large sets of horns wider than 7 feet across. It's not a reach to think that those resource-rich herbivores beckoned early man who followed these creatures from Asia into the Americas as the last ice age came to a close. In time, these nomadic peoples would diffuse throughout the Americas, creating large empires such as the Aztecs and the Incas in South America, and powerful tribes like the Cherokee, Iroquois, and Lakota in North America. They thrived, ranging from nomadic hunter-gatherers on the plains to great builders of mounds and pyramids who sustained themselves with complex agricultural systems. Generations of people passed, completely cut off from the world their ancestors migrated from. But in the 15th century, a tidal wave of change hit them like a hammer. The second Columbus and his voyage landed in the Caribbean. Their lives were destined to be shattered. European disease, the only unintentional killer, was the most devastating. Death rates made the Black Death centuries before in Europe look pedestrian. The fractured elements of what remained were unable to stand up to metal armor, weapons, and guns. And even if they could overwhelm the invaders with superior numbers, their cultures didn't operate in a structured and unified way. They were free, but this is what made them doomed. Their existence would parallel that of the buffalo. Once numerous and powerful, they would fall to forces beyond their control before going nearly extinct. But like wounded animals, many refused to go out without a fight. These warriors fought for their people, their gods, and their way of life. They would be maimed, abused, and forced to adapt to defend themselves. Today, we are going to progress through the centuries to look at 3 warriors among them. All of them would fight for the chance of their people to be free. All of them would die trying. Welcome to Dates and Dead Guys. But before we get to our story, today, in 2024, the majority of us live a substantial portion of our lives on the internet. But just because the internet is a digital space doesn't mean it's safe. That is why I use Delete Me, the most trusted source in online privacy. Behind the scenes, silent operators, data brokers, are collecting and selling your personal information without your consent. It's the reason why you receive targeted ads and unsolicited emails. We are even vulnerable to more malicious parties that look at your data as opportunities for scams and identity theft. As a rather private person, it's something that really bothers me. But that's where Delete Me comes in for help. Their service specializes in removing your personal information from data broker databases. By doing so, they act as a shield to protect you from the dangers of data exploitation. They give you back control of your online identity. Delete Me offers me peace of mind, because I know that they're helping protect me from unwanted exposure. Take charge of your privacy today and get 20% off of Delete Me US consumer plans. Go to joindeleteme.com/dates. Just use the promo code DATES at checkout. It is also linked in the video description. Don't let data brokers dictate your digital footprint. Choose Delete Me, because your privacy matters. But now back to our story. The Spanish arrived in South America in the late 1400s. When they did, they would start one of the largest population shifts in human history, as Europeans crossed the Atlantic in search of riches in the New World. While Spanish steel swords and early guns made short work of clubs and slingshots, the natives that Columbus misidentified as Indians continued to push back. In the 1532 Battle of Caramaca, less than 200 conquistadors obliterated an Incan army approaching 10,000. It was a massacre. These one-sided battles punctuated native and European engagements. Many civilizations, including the Aztecs and Incas, toppled over relatively quickly. Some even believed that these foreigners were manifestations of their gods. Most became subjugated. However, one tribe was not going to vanish without a fight. At the time of Spanish arrival, the Mapuche inhabited the valleys between the Itata and the Tolton rivers in Chile. Unlike neighboring tribes, whose traditions in hospitality led them into horrible situations, the Mapuche had zero tolerance for foreign occupation. The Spanish attempt to enslave the Mapuche began in the Arauco War in 1536, which would be one of the costliest wars for the Spanish in South America. The Spanish intended to enslave the Mapuche and force them to mine for gold around the coastal mountains. The Mapuche were not exactly in favor of this. Around the Biobío River, conflict between both parties continued, ultimately culminating in the Battle of Lagunillas on November 8, 1557. With overwhelming odds, the Spanish army under the command of Garcia Hurtado de Mendoza captured 100 Mapuche warriors, one of whom was named Galvarino. Little is recorded of Galvarino prior to this battle, but considering his next actions, there is little doubt that he'd been a strong and formidable opponent in the early years of the Arauco War. After their capture, Galvarino and the other prisoners were thrown before the feet of Mendoza. It was typical to maim the prisoners and send them back as a warning to instill fear. Hands and noses were severed from the body, creating obvious reminders to the prisoners and those around them of the cost to stand up to the Spanish. According to Alonso de Ercillo, author of La Araucana, which details the Spanish conquest in an epic poem, Galvarino's hands were hacked off in savage blows. But he, as a stoic warrior, remained stone-faced. As the others assisted the barely conscious warrior away, Galvarino turned and said, "Since I have some blood and strength with which to have a go at the Christians, I want to devote the rest of my life to this. I hope to gain my revenge." How the Spanish understood him is unknown, and may be more true in feeling than in verbiage. But it was clear that the spirit of this warrior wasn't broken the way the Spanish had intended. Forced to glare at his mutilated arms for the return trip, he was sent back to his tribe by Mendoza in order to share the message with the chief that Mapuche resistance was futile. While the Spaniards thought their disfiguration would have instilled fear, it clearly only kindled Galvarino's hatred, and he demanded that Calpalacan, their leader, seek justice for such barbarism. His diatribe against the Spanish went on until he passed out from blood loss. Inspired, Calpalacan and others prepared for attack. Later, Galvarino, only mildly recovered, was appointed the head of a war party to lead the attack. His malice would only go so far, and although he expressed a willingness to use his teeth, he would need more to stand a chance in combat. But Galvarino wouldn't need his hands to kill Spaniards. Taking some leather straps, they lashed knives, possibly made from scoria, copper, or bronze, to his unhealed stumps. They had likely been cauterized, an extremely painful process that would burn the wound closed so that he could not only lead his men into battle, but fight just as fiercely as before. On November 30th, 1557, this nightmare of a man led his warriors against the Spanish at the Battle of Millararpu, where Mendoza would be present. Galvarino was a terror, leading an ambush of the Spanish. The knives on his arms claimed the lives of many ill-prepared Spaniards, and he even clawed his way enough forward to take the life of Mendoza's number 2 man. Despite his leadership and the fear he invoked, Mapuche warriors were no match once they lost the element of surprise. When the dust settled, 3,000 more Mapuche warriors died, and 800 would be taken prisoner. It's possible that the Spanish lost less than 50 men. Galvarino was one of the captured, and stripped of his knives, his resistance would be minimal. Accounts differ on his method of execution. It's likely he was hanged, a typical death for Spanish prisoners, before being fed to Mendoza's warhounds. It was done in front of the other prisoners, and his death did somber the other Mapuche warriors, but it did not break them. Despite the remaining Mapuche being pushed back, the example of fearless warriors like Galvarino inspired continued resistance to colonization. War and skirmishes would continue for centuries, making them one of the most successful tribes to resist the inevitable. Through the process of European colonization, Native Americans were forced to adapt to stand any chance of keeping their territory, let alone survival. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Native groups adopted European weapons like rifles. Others to the west found incredible value in the horse. These advancements gave them better opportunities for resistance against the newcomers, although it also forced trade relationships. Still, most resistance could only serve as speed bumps in the complete colonization, as immigration was not slowing down by any metric. As European disease devastated their own populations, the population of Europeans was expanding. Early conquistadors were replaced by explorers, entrepreneurs, and even families escaping religious persecution and famine. The promise of the New World was simply too alluring. So alluring, in fact, that naturally the Europeans would go to war with each other over resources throughout America. The natives took sides in the majority of these conflicts in some hope to maintain their land and maintain trading relationships for European goods. Much of the alliances were simply based on survival. The popular notion, or cliché, of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. In North America, the French and British were in constant territorial dispute, which escalated into wars that mirrored confrontations back in Europe. In America, King William's War, followed by Queen Anne's War, followed by King George's War, and followed by the French and Indian War, perpetuated violence that the natives also participated in on both sides, usually being persuaded by promises that would later be broken. After Queen Anne's War ended in 1713, which momentarily ended official hostility between the powers, a smaller conflict known as Drummer's War began and lasted from 1722 to 1725. It was named after the British Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts, William Drummer. This three-year conflict was also called the Lovewell War, Father Rail's War, Greylock's War, the 3 Years' War, the Wabanaki-New England War, or the Fourth Anglo-Abenaki War. So semantically, this is a nightmare, which isn't entirely unique, as many conflicts of the time rarely settled on common nomenclature. In an alliance with the French, the Pequawket band of the Abenaki engaged the British in the border dispute over the Kennebec River. The Pequawket lived along the Saco River, in what is now New Hampshire and Maine. There they had found success cultivating corn. The French gave the Pequawket modern shotguns, provisions, and clothing to make them better equipped to fight the British. Their superior knowledge of the land and untraditional fighting methods made them effective allies for the French. Among the Pequawket was Chief Paugus. His name meant the oak. He was an effective and formidable warrior against the British. But all warriors need to eat, so he took a party to go hunting in the region. While on the expedition near present-day Fryeburg, Maine, Paugus heard distant gunshots and cautiously raced toward the sound. What he and his hunting party didn't know was that earlier that day, a lone Pequawket scout had been discovered by an Indian hunting party of 34 Englishmen, led by John Lovewell. Lovewell was a man renowned for his ability to collect native scalps after successfully tracking them, a prize at the time where there would be bounties. The group followed the scout for several hours that morning before firing, but the bullet didn't kill the scout immediately. With his dying efforts, he managed to unload a few shots in return, hitting Lovewell and several men before succumbing to his wounds. Paugus's party followed the sound. As they investigated, they found the tracks in the snow of Lovewell's men. They immediately shifted their intentions to war. With 70 Indians ready for battle, they had a clear advantage against the now mortally wounded Lovewell and his 34 men. When they caught up to the Europeans, the Pequawket attacked. In a hail of gunfire and war whoops, the natives set upon the men, killing many before the British could even organize themselves and return fire. When the British did prepare to fire a volley, the Pequawket warriors retreated to a safe distance. The British, now under command of Officer Ensign Wyman, found their own cover, and thus began an 11-hour exchange of gunfire. While the British were better shots, the Pequawket were faster and were experts in woodland warfare. An incredible part of this story is that from across battle lines, men on both sides recognized each other. Trade was common between the English and natives, and they had some familiarity, although yelling at each other from their covered positions was less than friendly. How this battle ends is a matter of debate, but the version poised by author Charles Edwards is what has become legend. Chief Paugus had advanced forward and come nearly face-to-face with one of Lovewell's fighters, John Chamberlain. Both shouldered their muskets at the same time to fire on the other and pulled the trigger. But nothing happened. The guns were fouled due to overuse and misfired after fighting for several hours. It left both men staring at each other. Awkwardly, I would guess. What happened next is strange. Paugus and Chamberlain both agreed to go down to a nearby creek and wash their weapons. Once at the creek, both raced to reload their rifles at the same time. All other fighting had ceased, as those in view of both men watched what was essentially a duel. Chief Paugus reloaded faster, and as he primed his rifle, using his powder horn, shouted, "Me kill you," at Chamberlain. "Perhaps not," Chamberlain shouted back. Before Paugus had finished priming, Chamberlain slammed the butt of his rifle into the sand. Enough powder filtered through his worn rifle to the priming pan, making it able to fire. Paugus finished priming just as Chamberlain raised his rifle, and there were two loud, nearly simultaneous cracks of thunder. Paugus's shot had claimed Chamberlain's hat, while Chamberlain's shot ripped open the chief's heart. Chief Paugus's death has become immortalized in a 19th century illustration of the duel, with the combatants only a few feet away. Perhaps Paugus had been too reliant on European technology, as he would have had a physical advantage. Or perhaps it never happened. This version of the story wasn't published until 1799, nearly 75 years after the battle. Although Chamberlain's low status as a private in Lovewell's force and widespread illiteracy make it plausible that the story was just told orally during that time. Nevertheless, Chamberlain and Paugus's stand drew an end to the conflict for that day, with the Pequawket vanishing into the forest following the death of the chief. Perhaps this was Paugus's intention in agreeing to a duel, to die bravely in battle, or to will his people to victory. Following the battle, the Pequawket returned to neutrality, trying to stay away from European conflicts. Unfortunately for the natives, neutrality was only increasing the velocity of their demise. Jumping ahead to the 1800s, the last remnants of Native Americans were holding on to a thread in North America. The tribes of South America and the east of North America had long since been conquered by European invaders. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, pushed by President Andrew Jackson, led to the Trail of Tears, as most tribes were pushed further and further west and then on to reservations. Any semblance of their former lifestyle had faded as America continued fulfilling its manifest destiny. Chief Victorio of the Warm Springs Apache had put up considerable resistance to the American military presence, but seemingly understanding the way the winds were blowing, encouraged raids and harassment to cease, and by 1869 had agreed to move to a reservation located near Ojo Caliente in New Mexico. The area had been one of their ancestral homelands and helped motivate their decision to relent and move to reservation. Washington promised that if Victorio and his Apache would stay on reservation, he and his people would be furnished with food and would be given thousands of blankets. But Victorio feared that the word of the white man was as worthless as the paper which he had accepted. While they could survive there, the inability to hunt as they once did caused shortage of food and made initial life there difficult. Over the next 8 years, the Warm Springs Apache would be moved several times to different locations. They were moved to the Tularosa Valley to the north, where many froze to death waiting for promised blankets. They were moved back to Ojo Caliente, before being moved to Camp Goodwin at San Carlos, where they were decimated by scorching temperatures and malaria. They were moved back again to Ojo Caliente, but in 1879, rumors began circulating for another move, and the tribe had had enough. It's said that Victorio deeply and sincerely desired peace throughout this process, but his previous distrust for the Americans had proved correct, and it was time for war. Chief Victorio and his band of roughly 150 Apache warriors began a campaign of guerrilla warfare between the Americans and Mexico, known as Victorio's War. Raids against settlements continued for over a year as Victorio plundered horses, ammunition, and supplies to maintain his resistance that served as a desperate struggle to regain the life and land of his people. Many times, the Apache were surrounded, but they always managed to escape. They were known for this innate ability. As a people, they were incredibly tough and resourceful. They were fierce and formidable. General George Crook once famously called the Apache the tiger of the human species. However, as Chief Victorio knew, the resistance was futile against the coming change. He would continue the resistance until his death, and that conclusion was quickly arriving. The last stand would occur at Tres Castillos, which is located in the northern Mexican state of Chihuahua. The desert is an open plain for miles, except for a series of small mountains that gave the reason for its name, 3 castles, which rise approximately 100 feet above the ground. In October of 1880, Victorio took his men into the region. They hoped to raid and gain supplies in order to stay free and continue their guerrilla campaign. Another Apache leader, Nana, traveling with Victorio, was famously known to be able to track down supplies like ammunition. But the raids led to increasing efforts to hunt them down. A force of approximately 250 Mexicans under the leadership of Joaquin Terrazas was able to encircle Victorio's party and force them to take refuge in those 3 castles. Victorio used the caves and rock piles to their advantage as his Apache force was severely outnumbered. After a day of resistance, the Apache ran out of ammunition and were overwhelmed. 62 warriors were killed and 68 prisoners were taken, while only a handful of Mexican soldiers had lost their lives. Of the deceased lay the 55-year-old chief, Victorio. The story of how he dies was told in different ways. Some say he mounted his horse and died charging the Mexican army. Others say he was found mortally wounded and was executed with a gunshot to the head. Most likely, he plunged his own knife into his heart, refusing again to become a prisoner on his own land. Several small groups of Apache men were not present in the battle, including Nana, who was away on a raid. Victorio's war might be thought of as the last major Indian resistance on the continent, although the tigers of the human species would fight for far longer. Geronimo would continue his rebellion until 1886. The Bronco Apache would fight well beyond that. But if you are a fan of this channel, you've probably already heard those stories.